Here we are. So we've made our pop-up design, and it was quite a small design on A4. So I've got a photocopy of mine here, and today I wanted to discuss making an outline design at the actual size that you're going to work at. So we've been working at A4, so it's a smaller version. And now we want to think about ways to enlarge it and scale it up to the actual size, which could well involve, once you've done that, joining lots of your A4 sheets of paper together. So we're going to look at ways to do that as well. So the first thing we need to do is to calculate the size that you want the actual finished work to be. So I've made a decision that the height of this tree is going to be 2.65 meters. So, you know, my room is a pretend room. If you're designing your work to fix to the wall in an actual room, you might want to measure, you know, the height of the wall and just decide where you want your, in my case, my tree to come up to. So I'm going to work just with this little detail of one of the flowers because it's a little bit easier for me to show you that in this confined space that we have. So what I've done is I've measured the size, the width of my flower on my small scale design, and it's 11 millimeters wide. And I've worked out that the actual size I want it to be is 180 millimeters wide. So what I need to work out now is how many times 11 goes in to 180, and that way I'll know what figure I need to times this 11 by to get my 180. I hope this makes sense. So how many 11s go into 180? So 180 divided by 11, and I get 16.36. So if I times 11 by 16.36, I get 180, the actual size that I want my flower to be. So this number here, 16.36, that's what's known as the scale. So if somebody said to me, oh, I like your little design, by the way, what scale is that? I could tell them it's 16.36, and they would know that every millimeter on my, or every foot or every meter, every one that I measure on here in whatever unit, if you times that by 16.36, you'll get the actual measurement. Now that is a really odd scale, 16.36. You'll see a scale on an architect's drawing, and it's always a sensible, easy number to multiply, like 5 or 20 or 100. So say 1 to 100, 1 to 200, you know, maybe 1 to 500. The reason I've got this slightly odd scale, and I often have these slightly awkward numbers to do my multiplying, is that I like to do my designs on A4 because they're easy to put in the post to somebody, they're easy to store. So I make my drawing the size that's convenient for me, and then I work backwards to the scale. But an architect wouldn't do it that way round. They would say, I'm going to make my drawing 1 to 15, and they would calculate right from the beginning that you know, you'd have to multiply my flower measurement by 15 to get the actual measurement. But anyway, mine works out as 16.36, and that's fine with me. I've made a note of it nice and big. I'm not going to forget it. And so when you write the scale, you always write it as the number 1, and then these 2 dots, the 2 symbol, and then the number. So at the bottom of your drawing, you could just make, you know, a little note of that. You wouldn't even need to write scale. You will come across this on architects' plans, but also on maps. So if you're somewhere where there isn't phone signal, you might be working from an actual map. And I just noticed this map, the London A to Z, also has a slightly odd scale. It's 1 to 21,477. So each single unit in here, you have to multiply each centimetre. If you multiply it by 21,477. So in this case, I think it's just because they wanted the book to be that size, a bit like we wanted our design to be that size. So we've worked out the scale. Now we need to draw up our, in my case, my flower. I need to get that flower from 11 millimeters to 180. Now, I've worked from the photograph here because it's a little bit easier to see on the camera. So a lot of my sample drawings were done from that photograph. So obviously in this case, it's bigger than 11 millimeters wide, but I've used that because it's a bit easier to see. And what I've done is I've drawn a grid over my smaller image. So these, and I've put letters and numbers. I find it easier then when I'm drawing. I know which square I'm drawing, so I can work out which one it is. So F6 will be this square. I find that useful for reference. So I've drawn the squares incredibly neatly. They're very square squares. It's important to get them pretty square if you can. And in this case, I've drawn them on top of the photocopy. I've actually printed the grid off on top of a photocopy of my flower. In your case, you might want to draw the grid on tracing paper, if you have some, over your small scale design. So put a piece of tracing paper over your small scale design and draw some squares. Then you need to draw another set of squares at a larger size. So whatever size you want your original to be, you draw another set of bigger squares, and just make sure that this grid, so I've got a row of 9 squares across here, just draw exactly the same thing, but larger. And make sure that this grid is big enough to fit your window or your flower or whichever item you're drawing up. You just need to make sure that you've got enough grid to fit the item into. You've probably done this before, I would imagine. You might have done it. Sometimes it's a little sort of copying out puzzle in a drawing book. But I use this method all the time. And the advantage of doing this, now you could, if you had access to a printer or a photocopier, you can enlarge things, but the paper only goes up to a certain size. With this, so these 2 squares here, if I drew them up, do you see, there are the 2 squares again. So I can make these squares as big as I want. And in this case, if each of these squares, these original squares, was drawn up at this size, my flower would end up being 1.7 meters across. And if I drew bigger squares still, do you see, you can make it as large as you want. Now I've drawn mine in already, so I've gone over, copied all this out already. But the method that you use is you just look at the individual square, and sometimes if it's a bit confusing, you could put a piece of paper or something there just to block out the other squares. So you're just concentrating on this one square. And then I find it helpful to maybe make a little dot at the edge of a square. I can look at, I can look here and think, oh, that's about a quarter of the way up. And maybe this point is just over halfway across. So, and then I would join these dots up. So obviously it depends on how intricate your drawing is, how long this is going to take. I've drawn quite a few squares over here because my flower has got lots of ripples and quite a lot of detail. The outline's quite complicated. If I was drawing an apple, say, I might make a grid that's just 3 squares across and 3 squares down, because I don't need all these squares for all this detail, because most of my squares are just going to be empty. I'm just following the outline around. On here, there are a couple of areas that were much more complicated, where the petals were overlapping. So what I've done is I've divided a couple of squares into 4 smaller squares. So here, this one, D2 here, it was just a bit too complicated. So I've added the 4 extra squares, and then I can do each one of those individually. There was too much going on for me to be able to copy it. So now we can imagine that you've got a grid drawn in pencil, and inside this grid you've drawn your design at the actual size that you're going to work on it. So we've been doing quite delicate drawing, and you don't really want these heavy lines running all the way across your drawing. So you could start out by drawing your grid lines very, very lightly. That's one possibility. You could rub them out once you've completed the drawing. You could rub the grid out and then work on the same piece of paper. The other option is to transfer this drawing to another piece of paper, so that you lose the grid. You keep this for reference, but you make a fair copy of it, we'd call it, without the grid lines on it. So there are different ways to do that. If you have tracing paper, you could put a piece of tracing paper down and you could trace over it. If you don't have any tracing paper, if you make these lines nice and strong, you can hold the drawing up to the window, put a clean piece of paper on top of it, and then trace over the lines that you see through the top piece of paper. So that will be one way to transfer it. If you do make a tracing, so I happen to have quite a lot of tracing paper, so I might make a tracing. Tracing paper is quite expensive, it's not the most economical way to do it, but often I reuse drawings, so tracings are quite useful to me because I can reuse the same flower in different designs. So I might make a tracing. And then obviously if you work on tracing paper, you have the option to turn it over and rub pencil on the back, and then put it down and trace over it to transfer the line. Or you can use, I happen to have this and you can get it online, it's graphite paper. That it just saves you a bit of time with putting the pencil on the back. So I've made a little note to myself, this side up, it's got graphite, so it's like having pencil rubbed all over a piece of paper. In fact, that's a possibility. I think I might try that, just rubbing pencil over a piece of paper, see if I can make some of this, we'll see. And so that goes face down. So I've written to myself this side up because the graphite's only on one side. And then you position your tracing on top. And then here I've got a biro. You need something fairly sort of firm to make the mark there. So, and then every so often you sort of peel it up and check. So I can see I've transferred it there. So you've worked out the scale of your design. You've enlarged it using the grid. Then you need to make a decision about whether to rub the grid out, whether to trace it onto more copy paper, or use tracing paper to transfer on to make your final piece of your final outline drawing that you're going to work on. There's one more thing I wanted to show you, which is, in the olden days, paper was very scarce, and large pieces of paper were even more scarce. So the drawing that we're doing, where we're joining up pieces of A4 copy paper, this was something that in the 14 and 1500s, artists did all the time. They would join these smaller pieces of paper together. That big rolls of paper, large sheets of paper, were very valuable and also very, very difficult to get hold of, or didn't exist at all. So they would join lots of pieces of paper together. And we've all heard of cartoons in relation to animation. So we think about a cartoon, but the word cartoon comes from the Italian for a large piece of paper, specifically a large piece of paper that you've joined up to make a big sheet, and that you use for transferring a design to another piece of paper, to the wall, to a piece of canvas. So the Italian for a large sheet of paper is cartone, and that's where we get cartoon. So that's fun fact of the day. But the traditional method, they didn't have tracing paper, they weren't using pencil, they probably would have been using chalk or charcoal. So instead, they would have their piece of paper. So we're imagining this is your copy paper. It probably would have been thicker, sort of rougher paper that they had. And then with a needle, in this case, I'm using a fairly chunky dressmaker's pin, they would make little holes along all of the lines, one by one. And this would be a job probably that an apprentice might do, sit there all day making these holes. And then how do you transfer this drawing to the wall or your piece of canvas? Well, they used a technique called pouncing, and it's putting powder through the holes, so a little bit of pigment, and it was called pouncing because they would fill a little bag up with, say, charcoal powder and then tap the surface. And because it was like a cat pouncing on a mouse or trying to trap a little bug, it was called pouncing. We don't do it now because fine powder is a health risk, and so we don't want to work with those sorts of materials these days. But I've got a very little bit of powder that isn't going to fly up into the air, so I'll just see whether I can make it work here. Oh, I think I've got rather, when I said I had a very little bit of powder, I might have slightly too much, but I've got another one to show you in a minute. So if I just carefully peel that back, can you see the outline there? So once they'd made that outline, they had two things. And you will also have, you'll be in the same situation. They had this, the cartoon. You could use it again and again. So you're tracing or you're drawing on your grid. You can use again and again. And often you see in paintings from the past, they will have taken this flower, turned it round, flipped it over, repeated it. And you'll see it, the same thing appearing in a lot of different paintings. That's because they've got their cartoon and they can reuse it. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk to you about also does relate a little bit to painting from the past, but it is relevant to what you're doing. So, as when cartoons, the large pieces of paper with the little holes in, so when they were invented, that was during the time of the Renaissance, or there was a lot of work doing large-scale paintings then. So making these cartoons, making designs in exactly the same way as you're making them was a popular thing. And this is a book, a Thames and Hudson book, about a particular set of paintings done in a technique called fresco. And the thing about fresco paintings is they were made on little patches of plaster. So there's a figure here. These, I think you can just see them, these two chaps here. On this drawing, which was in this book, I put a bit of green highlighter around them. Now those two heads there are these chaps here. And the reason I wanted to show you this is these outlines in red. If I point, it's easier with this. You can see these different outlines and these black outlines. They show you the cut lines, the patches of plaster. You had to paint one patch per day. So you'd put on an area of this special kind of lime plaster and you paint that during a day. And then at the end of the day, you'd cut off the excess plaster. And you can't make any sort of fancy shapes. You had to keep it really simple. And that means that quite often, if you look at frescoes like the Sistine Chapel ceiling, or, you know, these very famous fresco paintings of the Italian Renaissance, you see a lot of straight lines. And that's so that it's easier to cut the plaster. Now, the reason I'm showing you this, I know it probably seems slightly irrelevant, is that when I'm drawing up my flower, I don't want the drawing in my paper to be going right across the middle of my flower, because we're doing that very delicate kind of drawing. So if you're drawing, if you're enlarging something that's going to go across several sheets of paper, you need to have a think about where these joins are. And it could be, you might want to cut around in the same way as with the fresco plaster, you know, the way that they've done it. They've cut around, they've made the cut line around the neck here. So when you're joining your papers together, when you've done this sort of delicate section here, I would try and get something really complicated like that to be centered in a piece of paper, because when you're doing your smudging, if you hit that line, it will inevitably make a dark line and it will be a distraction. So think about these drawings. So I think that's probably quite important when you're working out the scale. It may be that you want to, once you've drawn up your grid, you might want to think quite carefully about how you join the paper together. Just very briefly, I'll show you, given that we're here, and I've just shown you the fresco and talked about it. This is actual fresco. So this is lime plaster. This is the same stuff. The frescoes in the book were painted in 1459. The recipe's still the same. So I've made this plaster. Here I've made an outline drawing, a cartoon there of this figure. There he is. And I've put the pigment through the holes. And then if I were in 1459, I would then need to join all the dots up. So just with water, joining that pigment up to make the lines. But then when they wanted to do the actual painting, this would all disappear. They put their patch of plaster on. Then having your reusable cartoon came in handy. They dust the pigment through again, but they'd have, you know, they'd have positioned it here over this figure. And then at the end of the day, I'm just putting my glove on because the lime plaster is something that you shouldn't really touch. They would use a trowel and just make, the line would have to be really simple. It couldn't be a fancy line. It would have to be something sort of quite straightforward, a sort of diagonal or a simple curve. And then this plaster, this excess, you would throw away. And then the next day you'd come back and put the plaster up to here. But as I said, you don't need to know that. All you need to know is that when you're drawing one, when you're making one of your very intricate drawings, so if you were drawing a figure like this, try not to have your paper joining, you know, right across the face. Or if you're drawing a window, it might be quite good if your paper ends at the edge of the windowsill, for example, before you do the upright, because if you're doing that beautiful delicate shading coming out of the window, again, the lines of the paper are going to interrupt it.
Can you use charcoal?
Yes, yes, yeah. You could use charcoal instead of pencil. That's absolutely fine. The only thing is that with the copy paper that we've been working on, the charcoal doesn't stick quite as well. Sometimes it sticks better to a rougher, grainier paper. So you just have to be a bit careful because again, it's that powdery substance. You know, you don't want to be breathing it in or having it flying around the place, but you could use charcoal delicately. It would be very nice. I think it would be really good in the same way as we did with the samples before. You could maybe try a section in charcoal and try a section in pencil. They also work really well together. You might find that doing your softer shadows or your larger areas of shadow in charcoal, it works really well. And you might want to get the finer details, like the details on your flower and the outline, and tiny details in pencil, so you can combine them. So I would maybe draw your outlines in pencil, so make your outlines in pencil, and then work into it with charcoal and with pencil. Next week, I'll just show you quickly how to do this kind of drawing using paints.